Good afternoon, everyone. I can see attendees starting to join in, and we've just started the broadcast, so I'll give this a minute before we start, but it's good to see so many people flying in. Okay, I think we've got all of the attendees registered, or at least the vast majority of people. So thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon with what will be the first of Electronic Frontiers, or EFA, talks. My name is Angus Murray and I'm the chair of Electronic Frontiers Australia's Policy and Research Committee. And I am extremely honoured to have the privilege of hosting these EFA talks. Electronic Frontiers Australia is a not-for-profit digital advocacy organisation that has a long history, having been founded in 1994. EFA for over 25 years has advocated and involved itself in the protection and promotion of Australians' digital rights, being civil liberties and human rights that exist in a digital environment. There has been a marked change, in my view, over the last 25 years in our digital landscape, and the prevalence and importance of digital rights and the way in which we engage with each other in the digital environment has become increasingly important. This project is launched because we have this year had a fairly tumultuous start to the decade, with a large number of business closed or pushed into digital environments, and government making a number of steps towards a digitalised community and a more digital focused society. The rights and freedoms that we have, if not sufficiently protected in advance, can be difficult to be regained later. It's important for us to talk about these rights and freedoms and how they apply in a digital environment, and how and where those rights are altered, and whether that's for future benefit or some other detriment that we may later regret. Before we start this first inaugural EFA talks, I wish to express my great gratitude to Michelle Mears on the board of Electronic Frontiers for the incredible support she's had in pulling together this project. She's behind the scenes at the moment, but has been a driving force of everything that we've done with this, and hopefully this is the start of something that has a great deal of longevity attached to it. I'd also like to thank ThoughtWorks, and particularly Robin Doherty, for the technical support and putting this together in their Zoom environment. There's been quite a bit of collaboration with ThoughtWorks over the years, and not only are they a great bunch of people to be working with, they're always extremely helpful in terms of pulling these things off and putting them together. So a big thank you to Robin and his team. The intention behind these talks is for us to engage with civil society experts, industry experts, members of the public, and hopefully at some stage politicians or people in the political space. This is an interactive forum, and at the bottom of your Zoom, you'll have a Q&A button. If you have questions as we're talking, please push them there. We're going to try and keep this to between 30 and 45 minutes, so it's not a too long take out of your day. Any questions that we have put that we're not able to answer, I and the EFA team, together with our guest speaker, will endeavour to answer those questions in a later blog post. And this presentation is being recorded, so it'll be available at a later stage if your colleagues, friends or family weren't able to make it today and you wish to share it. I'm extremely grateful to be able to introduce our first guest to EFA Talks, Dr Suelette Dreyfus. Dr Dreyfus is a lecturer in the Melbourne University School of Computing and Information Systems. She's a researcher, journalist and writer, and her fields of research and interest include information systems, digital security and privacy, as well as the impact on technology with respect to whistleblowing, health informatics and e-education, all of which are very relevant topics at the moment, and we're seeing quite a bit of this in the news that makes her a prime guest. She's also a long-term friend of one of the late board members of Electronic Frontiers Australia, Mr. Peter Tonoli. From my personal perspective, Peter was a good friend. Peter was an excellent person in the digital rights space, and Peter made many contributions behind the scenes, some of which haven't been seen, and probably the full effects of his life won't be known for many years to come. He was a prolific supporter of digital rights. He has a long history in this space, and he was a wealth of knowledge. I'm deeply saddened to have heard of his passing, and my condolences and respect goes to his family and to the innumerable number of people whose lives he's touched. Dr. Dreyfus has a much longer relationship with Peter Tonoli than I did, and she's fortunate to have that. So the first question I have for you, Dr. Dreyfus, my having been fortunate to know Peter over the last couple of years and enjoying banter with him over a drink, he was a remarkable man in my mind and by all accounts, and his behind-the-scenes contributions to digital rights in Australia are outstanding. You've known him for a long time, and I think it would be appropriate to start off with a few words from you about Peter.
So Peter Tonoli was a close personal friend of mine, as well as being someone who's very active in the community of digital rights with me for more than 25 years. So he was a director of Internet Australia, a vice chair as well as board member as EFA, and a chair of the General Advisory Standing Committee for the Australian Domain Administration, and the IT lead and technical fellow at Blueprint for Free Speech. He also was a project manager and systems architect at the University of Melbourne, where he did some quite amazing projects. My sort of earliest interactions with Peter were when he was quite involved with the community of suburbia.org.au, which was the first, and is still running, public access ISP, so not-for-profit for community groups, people, artists, advocacy people in Australia. And he worked to support that in the 1990s, just contributing his plethora of technical expertise. One of his closest and oldest friends, who was also one of the co-founders and runners of that, was Julian Assange. I know that Julian, who is, of course, sitting in Belmarsh Prison in London right now, facing extradition for the charges of committing journalism to the United States, he was quite devastated with the news of Peter Tonoli's death. I think one of the things that's quite important about that early era is that both Peter and Julian and all of the people who really were involved in setting up and running Suburbia from the get-go were very dedicated to principles of freedom of speech, early principles of digital rights. They supported online bloggers and journalists who published stories that were sometimes controversial and backed those stories up with evidence. I remember in particular cases of reporting on and with documents secret documents from inside Scientology that received numerous threatening legal letters to take the information down, and they really stood their ground on that. And of course, Julian Assange continues his fight in this space in very risky circumstances, where something like 60 out of 117, so about half of the prisons in the UK have COVID-19 cases. They've had more than 200 prisoners confirmed with it, and it's been described as a death trap because when the prisoners go to make a phone call, for example, when they get their turn, there isn't adequate cleaning of the handpiece. There isn't sanitation. You can't touch a surface, knowing that it's been wiped clean with a disinfectant. So he, like many other prisoners, is actually kept in his cell nearly 24 hours a day. And this is quite shocking, considering that his bail application was rejected by the judge because of the risk to prisoners who are nonviolent. And of course, he's not serving time for any crime in Britain. He's actually simply awaiting a court case around whether or not he should be extradited to the US for charges relating to being a publisher. So I think that's all very timely, and Peter's death is a shock to all of us, but I think it's great that he's been able, over his life, to contribute so much to digital rights in Australia and internationally.
Thank you. He's been a very important person, and the Assange story really, I think, has a lot of depth to it in terms of the full suite of consequences that arise from COVID-19 and the way that rights are being affected in a variety of different directions. And certainly the Assange story opens up a very large can of worms in terms of how we deal with, from a law enforcement and criminal justice perspective, people who are detained, and at a more broad level, particularly in relation to Assange, the long arm of the law, or at least the long arm of US law in terms of the extradition powers and the way that the globalization has potentially caused the spread of a global pandemic, but also there's a pandemic of extradition and a pandemic of enforcement of digital-based offences and the use of digital technology for law enforcement at a global level that really opens up a question about how far down that path should we be going and whether that's a desirable future. I had another question for you, Suelette, that sort of ties into that in terms of where we go on journalists and what role journalists have in terms of disclosing some of these surveillance tools that are being used by law enforcement. Usefully, a week ago, last Wednesday, there was the decision in Smethurst, and we've had a very big start to the year, and that is a big decision from the High Court that's had quite a bit of interesting commentary in terms of how far the High Court went and whether that was far enough or appropriate in relation to invasion of privacy torts and the technical approach that was taken that enabled the quashing of a warrant. But to remind ourselves, if we cast ourselves back into 2019, the federal police raided the home of Angus Smethurst, a journalist. And last week, the High Court unanimously held that the warrant issued to allow the raid on the journalist's house was invalid on the basis that the warrant didn't specifically state the offence that was being alleged. The court considered on that basis that it wasn't necessary to delve deeper into human rights, although there is some interesting commentary and an interesting dissent in terms of the way in which injunctions applied. Suelette, I am happy to dig more into the judgment, but I don't want to take this into too much of a legal analysis of High Court reasoning. I think it's better to take this from the perspective of what does this mean for journalists and what does this mean for Australians generally?
So I think that, I mean, it's obviously good that there was a unanimous ruling, but it was a unanimous ruling, a victory that was, it feels like largely on technicalities. So I describe it as, you know, and this is not wearing a lawyer hat. You hope that your High Court will make rulings with strong stands on press freedom, but I walked away from reading it feeling as though they'd ruled on a spelling error. And that's, of course, a gross generalization, but perhaps the feeling, the sentiment is right in that they have, I think, taken some stance cautiously on police not overreaching in their powers regarding warrants. So saying, well, you can't just make up a crime, or you can't just have such a broad definition that you're on a fishing exercise, really just trawling the bottom of the ocean for whatever you can pull up. You have to be more specific than that. And in fact, it's interesting because the AFP's overreach in this regard seems to be echo an earlier overreach on a freedom of speech and whistleblower issue. That was in Chelsea Manning's case, where initially the prosecution was going after her for, quote, wanton publishing. Now, there is no crime in the United States for wanton publishing, nor should there be. But it's a kind of example of how prosecutors will just make stuff up in some sort of broad definition to sweepingly try to get access to documents. I think more concerning is that it doesn't appear to me that the High Court was taking any sort of a definitive and brave stance on issues of press freedom specifically. And that's disappointing. We don't have as much protection in law as we should for that. But I would have really liked to have seen a strong statement that signaled to prosecutors, to the police who not only raided the national security reporter at News Limited, but also, of course, the ABC, and spent some 6 hours in their Ultimo headquarters also fishing. But then, of course, even more sort of disappointing was the High Court not ruling unanimously. In fact, a majority decision deciding that her equipment would not be returned to her, that it could be kept by the AFP. Only 3 judges argued that it should be returned to her. Now, that seems to me very disappointing, because I query whether that leaves the way open for that, the material that's on those devices to be used for other purposes. We've seen a lot of repurposing of data from this Commonwealth government. And I think there is a concern that the data on there, and certainly they had scanned the devices through specific word searches for items, including mentions of the ASD and story pitches. So who knows what they've turned up on that. The story that a whistleblower apparently had come to her with is no doubt in the public interest. So that was around whether or not the Australian Signals Directorate should be allowed to, as was being contemplated, change its purpose from spying externally to Australia on foreign powers and threats, turning it in to spy on our own domestic population. That's a pretty massive change in purpose for the full weight of Australia's spying technical capability, and was, of course, being hidden. So I think there's little doubt that you could say this was not in the public interest, but I think they were clearly chasing Ms. Smethurst's information to get at her whistleblower as well as her. The court did rule that the AFP had to pay the legal costs of her lawyers. So that's a small, pleasing outcome, because in the modern day environment, a lot of journalism is driven not just by what data you can get and whether you feel there's legal threat, but it's really the financial threat of being dragged through the courts and what you'll end up having to pay the lawyers in order to defend yourself.
Which makes it a very difficult situation to be in when the precedent could have been broader than what it was. At least the High Court's decision could have allowed a much broader series of certainties in terms of the way in which whistleblower protection operates, privacy operates, and these warrants that allow effectively signals directive or law enforcement to gain access to information, and the disparity that exists between government power and the citizens' rights, which includes the concept, and I wouldn't be doing myself justice if I didn't make the point that I keep making, that Australia really needs an enforceable federal human rights framework as a check and balance to this, that may give some slight greater certainty in terms of where Australians stand, that don't then require the cost of taking a matter like this all the way to the High Court. There's an interesting aspect that comes out of that, Suelette, and I understand you're doing work on this, and that's to do with the whistleblower rights and where whistleblowing stands. We're currently conducting this in a Zoom environment, and I'm sure that there might be some questions that we can address in a later talks about Zoom. But we're doing that because of a global pandemic and the need to socially isolate. As I understand, the COVID-19 pandemic was a whistleblowing exercise, and that there was whistleblowing at the early stage of this. And there's some interesting propositions and points that have come from Chinese judicial authorities. Could you talk a little bit about your research and work on the Chinese whistleblowing and the moratoriums on whistleblowing?
Yeah, I mean, so whistleblowing has been a very much an emerging thing over the last decade or so. And of course, there's famous, Daniel Ellsberg whistleblowing about the Vietnam War. But really, there are a lot of single points, not across a lot of domains. In the sort of 1990s, it became more mainstreamed, and there was emergence of whistleblower laws starting to protect them in the late 1990s. And it actually emerged in part out of kind of a women's movement. A lot of whistleblower cases were by women who had either had sexual harassment at work or who had pay or promotion discrimination against them, sort of as an internal policy of a company or organization. But more recently, we've seen the spread of whistleblower protection through things like the EU directive that was passed about a year ago, actually now, just almost exactly a year ago, in the European Parliament, which will apply to 27 countries. It's a requirement that by the end of 2021, they all adopt national laws that are consistent with a reasonably high standard directive. However, there hasn't been that much whistleblowing as a cultural change in Asia. There's been some activity in South Korea, notably with instituting whistleblower protections in the police force. There's been a little bit of activity in Malaysia around significant amount of corruption that was there before the change in government. So there've been bits and pieces, but not really widespread, and not a great deal out of China. One of the things that's been interesting is one of the earliest milestones in the history of this COVID-19 pandemic was a whistleblower, a doctor, I think an ophthalmologist, who had picked up that this disease was showing up, that it was consistent with SARS-like symptoms, and that he reported it to a community of doctors electronically, who he's part of a community with in Wuhan. And he suffered reprisal from local authorities as a result of it, who tried to force him to recant and put enormous pressure on him. That case subsequently went to the High Court in China. And interestingly, in the actual case decision, there is some recognition of the fact that there's a difference between people who spread false news, fake news, or propaganda, and people who share information in the public interest. And that this doctor was unfairly suffering retaliation, which is the classic punishment for whistleblowers, because he was actually telling the truth. Now, in fact, we believe there are 8 whistleblowers from China at least, but who were related to this case, only 6 of whom are known. That particular doctor was rehabilitated in China. So I think it looks like the national government took matters into their own hand and realized that this was perhaps not the best approach. Whistleblowing is particularly known as being an excellent early warning system, and maybe traditionally in a corporate setting that's been about whether there's been crime, committed fraud, or that sort of thing. But in a health setting, it really, can obviously warn you about a coming epidemic. And we've now seen some other whistleblowers come out of China, nurses who have disputed the figures that have been provided about levels of infection or death. And I think that's been very important. It's been a more subtle thing, but equally important that the senior levels of Chinese decision-making have recognized the importance of this early warning system, and that there's been support from the people. So, more particularly in the last week and a half, 2 weeks, there's been a petition that's been going around internationally with signatures from leading civil society groups and leaders, including professors, experts, NGOs from around the world, calling on governments internationally to not retaliate against whistleblowers. We've seen health whistleblowers out of New York describing the conditions. Out of the UK, you've seen nurses who don't have proper protective gear provided to them. They've been wearing garbage bags, and 3 of them contracted coronavirus. So at least 3 of them. And so this is actually very relevant because data security and actual anonymity that can be provided by technology provides essential protection for whistleblowers, so that they're not actually retaliated against when they tell us the truth that we need to know.
Yeah, it serves as a very important check and balance, and a part of the very rich myriad of systems and controls that we need to have in society to allow these things to come out and be transparent and discussed in a public forum, which is important to a full and proper, open, democratic society in the way that we're governed. And as this is an international issue, it's extremely important that this is something that's transparent on the international stage. It has been a big week, as you said, and one of the things that have happened this week that tie into that concept of transparency and openness from government is the very recent discussion that we've been having. And there's a question in the Q&A that we have that goes exactly to this. And that is about the federal government and its tracing app and the discussion that's happened over that in the last couple of days. The federal government has assured us that the coronavirus tracing app won't be tracking Australians. We're assured that all it will tell government is that you and I were for 15 minutes or more within 1.5 minutes proximity to each other, and it won't tell government where. To me, that seems like a very dubious claim, and it's the top of a very slippery slide and should be a real concern for the community. I'd also personally pause and say, if this is good enough for the Australian community, I'd love to see Peter Dutton's log of this app over the last couple of weeks. But from your perspective, Suelette, is there a balance that can be reached here? Is there an intersection that you can see that resolves?
Oh, yeah. I mean, one of the things that I find most disturbing about this public discussion is that it's been framed by various people in the government as being, this is either about your privacy or about protecting people from the virus. You can have one, but not both. Well, that is just a load of malarkey. So if you choose a decentralized option, you can have both. Now, obviously, all contact tracing is going to involve some incursion into privacy. It's not a perfect world, but you can do a lot better or a lot worse, depending on the model that you choose. We think the Australian government's option is around Trace Together, which is what Singapore government has produced. They have open sourced it. That's a very good thing. However, it is still a centralized solution and therefore more privacy infringing. And effectively what it does is if you and I beacon to each other because we're both in the supermarket at the same time, and you send me some random looking numbers and I send you some random looking numbers, and then I become I test positive for it, then a list of all of the random looking numbers that I've received, I will then provide to the government, and they will identify the people who've been in proximity to me, and then they will contact those people to say they've been exposed. The alternative, the decentralized model, and that's been put forward, for example, by a group out of Europe, the DP3T. There's also COVID Watch, a proposal, but similar decentralized solutions is not a list of every beacon that you've received, but rather it's every beacon that you've sent. So in this case, you can imagine extrapolating it from technology into a kind of a more common person's language, that every day there's a bulletin board, like you'd see it in old primary school, a cork bulletin board with a thumbtack on it, and someone who's tested positive thumbtacks up a list of all of the beacons that they have actually been sent. And sorry, that you've sent, that they've actually sent out. And then what you would do is you would go and scan that list regularly and say, oh, I actually received one of those random looking numbers. I was sent one of those beacons by someone. I must have been exposed. And the beauty of this system is there's not a central authority that has this information. So when the government says it's not tracking you, what it may mean is it's not tracking you in a GPS sense. Although query, if this is done via Bluetooth, whether or not there might not be some other capacity to track you from Bluetooth beacons in shopping mall stores, whether there is some cross correlation of other data that might give you a location. But even if we take what has been told to us at face value, there's no doubt that one of the decentralized solution versions is better for privacy and still gives you coronavirus tracking. Now, my big question to the government is, if Scott Morrison is so keen for 40% plus of Australians to sign on with this app, why would you not choose the most privacy enhancing option that also tracked the spread of the virus? Why would you not choose what the cryptography community has told us in decentralized solutions is the most privacy enhancing? Because you need trust if people are going to voluntarily download it. So we know that the Trace Together app in Singapore was reported as getting 20% take up. I suspect it's actually possibly even less than that. That's not reaching the threshold. By one estimate I read out of Oxford, researchers were saying you need at least 50% of the population sign on. Whatever the number is, 20% is probably not the right number. So that's pretty important. There are some other options out there. There's something called the SIMMEL, SIMMEL, which is a pen-like device, and it provides more privacy still. And then, of course, we've seen most recently Apple and Google coming together to announce that they would provide some support in this space as well. Details to come. One thing I also find amazing about the Commonwealth government's proposal is we have not a lot of detail about it. They've said basically, take it on trust. I expect you to take it on trust. They have released the code to a small number of people. They've asked it to be checked by ASD, the Cybersecurity Center, at least one other center that is external, but all of whom receive large funding or are fully funded by the Commonwealth government. That's not an independent review. And I would have thought that asking our top spy agencies' technical experts to review it should occur after there had been an independent community review through open sourcing. And a final determined model came from that was robust in the first instance, rather than before it.
I think that's a really good point. And we've had quite a few questions come in on this. So this is obviously the hot topic. To answer a couple of those questions, and I won't mention names in answering these questions because they're more than able to be done anonymously. Firstly, there are 58 attendees currently in this webinar. And some of the questions tie into where you were just going, Suelette, so I might wrap these together and put them back to you. Effectively, there are two questions that are very similar about the way that the government is releasing this and the way that information is being put out, and that federal government wouldn't itself have access to data, but there isn't really much clarity about who would have access to the data. And then tied into that is, aren't there already BLE or collectors for traffic and advertising purposes, and couldn't those operators be used for a similar purpose? From my perspective, and just before you answer that, Suelette, I'm going to reinforce something you said there about the way that this is being announced. It's a very lackluster, very jolty approach that isn't really well thought through. And I appreciate the need for haste on these things. But the concept that's occurring here is Australians will be tracked by the federal government, and that is acceptable. The normative shift that creates and the acceptance that we start to put behind this, I think is worth as much consideration as the technical operation itself. Because once this starts to be accepted, and I understand that other private organisations like Google and Apple may already be doing this, but when government starts doing it, there's a pause for thought about what that means for the future and what norm we shift there. We go into those questions about the way in which this is being released and the access to source and whether other operators could be used. Do you have a comment on that, Suelette?
I don't know enough about the specifics of what they have planned, but I am concerned to say, and so I'm a little loath to hypothesize, except I can talk about Trace Together and the fact that they've said it's going to be based on the Singapore model. I'm a little concerned that the relevant minister involved said, don't worry, trust us, because among other things, at the end of all this, we'll delete all the data that the Commonwealth has. But didn't he just say that the Commonwealth wasn't keeping any of the data? So how can you have both those things? Either you're promising nothing or you're lying about something. And that seems to me particularly concerning as well. Now, as I understand the theory of how they're doing it, it will be the state health departments that will have this information. But I think that the place that we should be looking at is, for example, the European Parliament through the European Commission released in the last week, at the end of last week, a toolbox for what any tracing app should contain and kind of rules of the game. And those include things that are around the basic privacy principles embedded now in European law. Don't collect more data than you need to. Don't keep it longer than you need to. Delete it because of that. Delete it securely. Make sure that it's secure. They included anonymity among the important factors in this. So there are a whole set of elements here that we have seen some vague promises on from the government, but not a strong commitment to. They have said that they will be open and transparent. Really? Why haven't we seen the code then? Obviously, the code is done enough to give to well funded by government organizations to do the review. So why wouldn't they make it open to public review? I think that at this stage, we may possibly be in safer hands from what GAPL, as some people are calling the Apple-Google coalition, may provide. And I say that only because there have been reports out of the UK of GAPL being at loggerheads with the NHS, driven by government, about how much privacy their app that will run on the API they provide will actually give individuals, how much privacy protection there will be. And it would appear as though GAPL actually wants more and the government wants less. That's a little bit reassuring to me, because it makes me feel as though maybe surprisingly these organizations that haven't perhaps had a strong history of privacy protection have realized that in the face of reputation damage from Facebook and Cambridge Analytica and the rest of it, they need to have a different approach to how they do business. And maybe this is the dawn of a new era in that regard. Hope springs eternal. I think also there may be a factor in this for them in the ruling of the ACCC in the last week regarding them having to pay for news content. And so in that sort of relationship with news providers, maybe they realize that they need to do something more in the public interest, that's visibly in the public interest, and that would be one way to do it.
Which I think it raises the interesting question again of if there's a corporate social responsibility that's pushing private enterprise to be the role model to which government can aspire to be, it really puts a question about what our representative responsible government is doing that means that they're falling behind that role model status of private enterprise. And one of the comments that we've just got through is that this is a missed opportunity to call it Google. Is a nice name for it as well. I'm conscious of the time and also conscious that these are not to be long drawn out discussions. And you've given us a lot to think about there, Suelette, which is very much appreciated. If I can turn you to a final question, and that puts us in the future. If I could ask you to place yourself in the year 2050, which sounds like a science fiction concept, but it's not that far away. You in 2050, do you have a message to us today?
So I think we have two possible paths, and the possible paths that would be offered to the me of the future. In one path, we have a dystopian world that is ever more control, tracking, eventually, potentially even, with behavioral analysis and predictive analytics, in a sense, a kind of mind and behavior reading. So the ultimate invasion of your privacy of thought and action. You can have that. And with few to no freedoms. You can have a 1984 George Orwell world. Or you can have a world that is much freer, freer in ideas, in creativity, in concepts, in ability to actually action those ideas, because we actually have a world that is juster and fairer when it comes to economic distribution, which means that the massive gains we've had from things like technological advance make us all wealthy enough to have enough leisure time to do creative things that contribute back to our society and our communities. And perhaps this time out in COVID has been a little bit of a reminder of what might be possible in that regard when we're not all working 60 hours a week and rushing from one place to the next. So I would look back and say, well, you have these two paths. It is not a foregone conclusion. You can choose which of those. And I hope very much that it is the freedom and creativity path, not the dystopian one.
I think that's a really good place to call this, and that's a very very strong message to have about the options we have for the future and where we might go. I don't know how to do rounds of applause.
Can I say one more thing? It's really important that groups like EFA and Blueprint for Free Speech and Access Now and all of the civil society groups and leaders, including academic experts, legal experts, technical experts, are not just active now, but becoming more active, because the only way to make sure that that dystopian path isn't the one chosen is for more and more people to get involved in that way, to be active, contribute what they can as they can in time and expertise, contributions. So I'm hopeful that there will be 20 or 30 other Peter Tonolis out there, and that they will make sure we're on the right path. Sorry, go ahead. I just wanted to add that in.
No, thank you. Very beautifully said. I was just about to offer an applause virtually on behalf of Electronic Frontiers Australia and the audience that's listening to us for sharing your insights and for the very wise words you've spoken, Suelette, and for the very heartfelt comments about the late Peter Tonoli. On behalf of Electronic Frontiers, very much appreciate you being here for the inaugural EFA talks. We will be back again in 2 weeks on the 6th of May with Lucy from Access Now to take a slightly more broad and European perspective on this. I'd like to thank everyone for joining in on this. There will be a recording of this that you're able to share. There are quite a few people joined today. It would be great to keep the momentum of this going, keep the discussion going. And from everyone, thank you and goodbye.